Okay, welcome back to the Zemar podcast. I have a special guest in our industry. He's doing a lot of great things on the West Coast, or at least a lot more West Coast than I am. I brought on Chris Wolpert, if I hopefully I pronounced that right. But welcome
Yeah,
to the show. Go ahead and give a quick introduction of yourself to our fans.
yeah. Well, thanks, Butch. I appreciate it. First of all, having me on here today. And yeah, Chris Wolpert. I'm in Steilacoom, Washington, so kind of the greater Seattle area, if you will. And I've been in. I started my firm, GBS, back in 2016. So we're going on almost 6 years now at this point. Kind of hard to believe. It just flies by. We were chatting off air
Yeah,
about just grit and determination and just making it work in these early years. And hopefully, we're kind of getting out of those infancy stages, both you and I, Butch.
hmm
But yeah, so our mission at GBS here is to eliminate employees' out-of-pocket expenses while simultaneously guiding them to the highest quality healthcare. And so we can certainly talk about that some more. But I know one of the things you want to talk about is the Hit Zero book,
yeah.
the comic book I produced last year as a kind of a marketing piece slash vanity project. But
hmm
it's been a ton of fun, and we've had a lot of a lot of great attention because of it, and it's done exactly what I designed it to do, which is to be that marketing piece that's a pattern interrupt, and that
hmm
is kind of an exciting thing to for an otherwise very dull subject in insurance.
For
So,
sure. So I'm actually curious. So where did the comic idea, book idea came from?
well, I had when I started my firm, I knew I wanted to write a book. I wanted to become an author because it's a great way to establish yourself, so establish some credibility, and
Yeah.
establish yourself as a subject matter expert.
hmm
And so I'd started to listen to a few podcasts about writing books and different things, and I kind of had some ideas bubbling around in my head, and a lot of them had to do with kind of this post ACA world of health insurance. And I started writing an outline and realized, oh my gosh, this is going to be so boring. Nobody's going to want to read this. I don't even want to write it. So I kept listening. And then at one point on some podcast, there was a guy who was talking about using a hero's journey framework. So you think about Joseph Campbell, the hero with 1,000 faces, and the power of myth and all that. And he talked about that quite a bit. And around that same time, this was 2016, there was a book by Donald Miller called Story Branding, and I don't know if you're familiar with that at all,
Yes.
but
hmm
it was exactly that. It was using this framework to create a story of a
hmm
hero's journey where you're taking your audience, you're taking your prospects, you're taking your clients on this journey where they're the hero,
hmm
you are the guide, right? So they're
hmm
Luke Skywalker, you're Yoda, you're taking them on this journey. And I just thought, man, that sounds a lot more exciting and interesting. And
Sure.
then I don't know where exactly, I can't remember exactly how it happened, but to take it a step further, then I thought, all right, well, what if I turn this into a comic book and really just kind of go all in on this
hmm
idea? And the other thought there too was like, look, who's going to want to read, a 200-page book? Whereas, if you put together a comic book, which a standard comic book's about 22 pages, that's something that somebody could read through
hmm
in 20 minutes, right,
hmm
30 minutes, or
Sure.
read through it a number of times and kind of absorb those lessons or what have you. So that's really kind of where everything started, was at that point.
What were you a comic book fan growing up? Is that where kind of like the idea came from and you knew how to outline it, or did you get help with the outline on it?
Oh yeah, no, I had well, yes, I was certainly a comic book fan at certain
hmm
points in my
Sure.
childhood and things like
Sure.
that, and then kind of rekindled that. Actually, my kids are like big fans of the Marvel, cinematic universe, of
Awesome.
course, now, right?
hmm
And so
hmm
so anyway, so yeah, I what I ended up doing was got online and looked up a couple of books. There's a few of these books about kind of how to write comics and things. And so just
hmm
thinking about, rather than writing a book or writing an essay type of thing,
hmm
you're really writing a script or almost a screenplay, because you have
Sure.
to talk, what's happening in each panel, and then you've got
Sure.
narrative and dialogue and
hmm
action and different things. So yeah, so I did quite a bit of reading on that, listened to a few podcasts. There really wasn't much great out there in terms of podcasts, but there's a couple really good books that I kept going back to as a reference. And then the other thing I did too was just started, digging up old comics and kind of looking at those and kind of getting ideas and inspiration from those too. So,
and I think the whole idea is great. So when you talked about when you were putting all the details together and you're like, who's gonna be interested in this because it's all boring stuff. I actually have a published book, and this is truth, a testimonial to what you just said. And I just did the dry version, right? So not this colorful comic, and I did a dry version. Of course, I didn't do it to sell, but most people never read it. No, I mean,
yeah.
I got credibility for being an author. So there was that, because authority on the subject, essentially. But outside of that, there might have been 2 or 3 people, and I tell you, the ones that I know that called me on it were CPAs, because they were talking about the numbers or some tax credits or what the penalties were, and they wanted more clarity. And so it was more related to their industry, and so it didn't go over as well as I thought it would be. And I think this is a very creative idea. Again, we're talking to Chris Wolpert, and he author of Hit Zero: The Quest to Make Healthcare a Controllable Expense. So during inside the comic book that you had created, you actually walked through the path that I assume that you walk through the employers, right? So we walk in, we're a dime a dozen, right? So, and you emphasize that in the beginning, at least that was my impression. You have all these
Yep.
people negotiating these new rates. And that's one thing I always said, there's always a guy that comes in lower, right? And so, and they're like, well, you're 15% increase, and this guy gets a 12% increase. And this guy's like, well, hold on, I got you at 9% increase. But at
Yep.
the same time, you're increasing the out-of-pocket expenses. This is what I call the American way, right? Just premiums go up, out-of-pockets go up, and more costs being passed on to the employees. So just give me some insight on your process with that. You don't have to get into a whole lot of nitty-gritty, and then the kind of like the conversation you take them to and say, okay, there's another way, there's a different way we could do this.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. Well, there are two things. One was, especially in the employee benefits world today, I feel like compared to several years ago, maybe, and certainly as you start to go up market, which I know you and I are both doing, and I think everybody wants to do generally. I don't care what industry you're in. You want to go up market. You want to get bigger clients. You want to, those types. Is Jerry Maguire, right? You want to have a bigger impact with your clients, right?
Right.
And so what was important was that I have 2 heroes in this story. One being the CFO, the other being the HR director. And the discussion really typically is with one of those 2 people in the beginning, but you always have to build that consensus. And that's kind of, I guess, the point I was getting at, is that you really need to build consensus with those 2 departments. And then many times leadership, or the CEO or CFO, or the just other people within the C-suite, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really what I wanted to do with that. But you're right, that's exactly what I wanted to do with the jackalopes. And I'll tell you a quick story on kind of how I arrived at that. Was I had written this comic book, I had done a number of drafts. I was still kind of struggling with who was going to be the mentor character, right? Who was I going to be? And then who was going to be the jackalopes, or who was going to be the traditional broker with a big house that's bringing, fully insured, solutions, and that's it. And continue, can just helping or having the employers continue on this hamster wheel of medical trend, 10% renewal increases each year, and really no solutions that have any effect in a positive way in the end on the employee. And so that was kind of what how I found that was. There was a guy I'm connected with on LinkedIn that had mentioned this Wolpertinger and was like, have you ever heard of this and that? And I was like, no. And it was just kind of this. Anyways, we went back and forth a little bit, and he was like, why don't just Google it? It's just funny that your last name is so close to it and all this. And this was a guy that was he lives somewhere in the UK now, but he was originally from Germany. And so he told me a little bit about this little creature, this little legend or whatever. So I look it up, and I'm like, oh, this is
Mm-hmm.
basically a jackalope, but
Mm-hmm.
it's got a few other enhancements to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's got
Right. Right.
owl wings, it's got these sharp fangs, it's got,
Mm-hmm.
you know, a number of these other characteristics. And
Mm-hmm.
then I just had this like epiphany. It was like, oh my gosh, like that would be perfect. That can be because I think there's generally probably not a lot of people in North America that have heard of the Wolpertinger. And then, but
Mm-hmm.
yet they have heard of the jackalope and they are familiar with kind of the legend behind the jackalope and
Yep.
just the, you know, again, this mysterious magical creature that's kind of sort of a joke, but you know, so anyways, and that was part of, in a way, that was part of me trying to not take this too seriously, right? And just kind
Mm-hmm.
of inject a little bit of humor into this as well. And so, anyway, so yeah, so that's
Yeah.
how I kind of arrived at using the jackalopes and the Wolpertinger and
Yeah.
having them be the shadow figure as well as the mentor figure
Yeah. Sure.
in the hero's journey. So
Yeah. Now you had during that background you just gave, so you had pointed out something I think is important. At least that was the way my take on it. The HR and the CFO, right? So there's always this huge disconnect. It's almost like sales and marketing. They always say there's never on the same page. There's just two different things. One's blaming the other, and so and my experience has validated this too, where the HR is tasked with a responsibility of managing, in some cases, millions of dollars worth of cost, right? And
yep,
it's usually middle management, and then they're scrutinizing costs, and they're HR, and they're not a numbers person necessarily. I mean, they become a numbers person because of what they do, but they don't know how to scrutinize costs. They don't know how to go line by line and figure out, okay, what are we doing right and what are we doing wrong? That's what the CFO does, but the CFO doesn't understand benefits, so they just delegate it
right,
downstream. And so there's a process. Obviously, you've been working with your clients of getting those two back in the same room and try to figure out, okay, there is a correlation of having happy employees and getting our costs lower.
yeah,
And that's the one thing that CFOs across the country are not understanding. And obviously it's our target market in a lot of ways because we need to go a line by line. And so I think it's key what you're going through, because here's America's solution, right? So a lot of us are threatened by the single payer system, but there's an
mm-hmm.
employer based system right now that you could actually go in and um, in your book, you talk about eliminating your employees' costs and then reversing the healthcare trend. It's nothing that is, I would say brand new. It's been around for some time, and so
Right.
I think elaborating on that in your book, and then obviously what you do with your clients is definitely key. But obviously, it sounds too good to be true. So when you walk your clients through it, what are some of the things that kind of get some validation that this is a good solid ground to move into the right direction?
Well, you know, typically, again, you're building that consensus. So I'm always kind of like on two sides of the fence where you're right. You know, you're
Hmm.
100% right. You know,
Hmm.
the CFO, to boil it down,
Hmm.
they're numbers oriented and they're strategic, whereas HR is people oriented and they're task driven. So for them, I mean, not and that's I'm generalizing here. So
Sure.
HR
Go.
people, don't be upset with me.
Yeah.
CFOs don't, you know,
Yeah.
there's
Absolutely.
exceptions to that certainly, but generally that's what I find. And so because HR is doing 12 other things, and I kind of referenced that early in the book. I meant,
Hmm.
you know, I kind of list out first of all what the CFO's responsibilities are, and there's, you know, kind of 4 or 5 things, and then I
Sure.
make a
Sure.
list of what HR is responsible for, and it's like, you know, over a dozen things, right? So they're wearing a lot of different hats, and so I find generally what they base their decision on is what's going to be the least amount of employee noise, the
Hmm.
least amount of change, and what's going to be, you know, they don't want to go against the grain
Hmm.
because, to your point, they're not necessarily strategic thinkers. They're not necessarily well trained in finance and things like that. So that's what I really kind of tried to highlight was in the very beginning of that book was the differences, and then what I find is with using that value proposition of eliminating employees' out-of-pocket expenses while simultaneously guiding them to the highest quality healthcare. The
Hmm.
eliminate that. So what it does, that's really stimulates a conversation where we're drawing both of them in.
Mm-hmm.
because, you know, the CFO hears that initially and thinks, okay, well, high quality healthcare is great, but
Mm-hmm.
I care about the numbers. And if you're telling me you're going to enhance the plan,
Mm-hmm.
then where my brain goes, because the conditioning that's happened over the years, that means that we're going to be, you know, raising deductibles and out of pocket expenses and things,
Sure.
or sorry, we're going to be raising the premiums if we're going to start eliminating that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then and then with the HR person, they hear that and they think, wow, like this is a great potential retention or recruitment tool,
Mm-hmm.
and could potentially be an enhancement that would make everybody happy. So so it starts to kind of get their creative juices flowing, and the fact that they're hearing something new or different. And to your point, this isn't new. This has
Yeah.
been around for several years now in many cases, these types of strategies. But it's really just kind of bringing those to you know, just kind of bringing those to the forefront, and then, you know, having them come in and start to understand how these things overlap with each other, and really begin to show them the misaligned incentives that exist within the system, how it's operated for decades. And one
Mm-hmm.
of the things that, you know, I always point out to them is that, hey, look, the system is functioning exactly the way it was designed to. And the problem is that you as the employer, you're footing the bill for all this, but you and your employees are really the afterthought in all this, right? The carriers have misaligned incentives against you. The providers, the hospitals, the facilities have misaligned incentives against you. And of course, so do the brokerages. And it's existed that way for, you know, probably longer than you and I have been alive at this point,
Yes.
Butch. So
Correct. Yeah.
so that's part of, you know, we're swimming against the current in many ways.
Yes.
So to unravel some of that old conditioning is you know, that's really, it's really
Mm-hmm.
difficult. And that's one of the big points in this book, is that as we start to get into it, you
Mm-hmm.
know, is to smash that old limited belief kind of thinking that you've had for a long time. So
Yeah, and
yeah.
you brought up a great point. I always preach that the industry taught itself how to purchase benefit insurance for the workplace, and so and it's just this vicious cycle because
Yep.
the employers only know one way because they were conditioned by the broker, and the financial incentive, like you said, you use the word incentive. It's a financial incentive that keeps looping itself. It's working the exact same way it's designed. That's why, you know, the repercussions of regulations is they figure out ways around it. So they try to put restrictions on what the insurance company could actually do, and they're like, yeah, take that. And then they're
Yeah.
like, okay, we just figured out a different way to make money. And so now
Yeah.
they're making more money than they were before thanks to new regulation. And so
Yeah.
and then our job as brokers definitely are to point that out. And Chris is indirectly competition. He's on the East Coast, but he collaborates with a bunch of insurance agents. We work together. I mean, there's guys like you and I are actually going to start moving this trend in the right direction. And we're talking to Chris Wolpert here. He's actually a two-time author. Notice it behind you. I don't have a nice picture on here, but Chris is definitely an authority in the marketplace. And now Chris, if anybody that's listening to this podcast wanted to reach out and expand the conversation that we had today, or reach out and need your services for that matter, how do they get in touch with you? What's the best way to do that?
Yeah, you know, I'd say I'm probably most active on LinkedIn as far as social media goes. So you can just find me on there at Chris Wolpert. Our website is gbsbenefitsgroup.com. So that's obviously a good way to get in touch with us, kind of see our work.
Mm-hmm.
We've got, you know, free downloads on the
Mm-hmm.
website and stuff like that too.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I'm a sales guy, so I don't hide myself. So you can always call me, text me on my cell phone at 253-228-8336.
Sounds good. So I'm going to have these in the show notes when we get this published. So we have the two links. I'll put the phone number in there. And if anybody wants to reach out to Chris and learn about his book, his new book is Hit Zero. Pick it up today. It's definitely good. I went through it. It's definitely, even just me being in the industry, I validate all the things that are in here. Pick up his book. It's definitely a key piece when you're starting to build or continue your benefits program. Hey,
You bet.
Chris, I know you're busy. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Butch. I appreciate it.
Yep. See you.